Welcome to Battlefield Ledger's Chronicles of the Great War, year by year. All right, buckle up, Buttercup, because today we are diving headfirst into 1915.
The year the Great War decided to live up to its name and then some.
Yeah, 1914 might have had some of that, no gallant, honorable warfare going off to die for king and country kind of vibe.
Dashing young lads marching off with flowers in their rifles.
But by 1915, the rose-tinted glasses had shattered and the world got a good hard look at the meat grinder.
And let me tell you, the butchers in charge of this grinder, not exactly Michelin star chefs.
More like they got their training from a weekend barbecue gone horribly wrong.
Exactly. 1915 is where the cracks in everyone's oh-so-civilized facade become gaping, festering wounds. You've got tactics straight out of the Napoleonic Wars, completely outmatched by the technology of the 20th century.
Like bringing a musket to a machine gun fight.
Precisely. And the political maneuvering behind the scenes would make even Machiavelli raise an eyebrow.
More backstabbing than a season of Game of Thrones.
With far higher stakes, unfortunately. We're talking millions of lives hanging in the balance.
Okay, so for this deep dive, we've got our usual smorgasbord of sources.
Battle timelines, first-hand accounts, official reports. Some so dry they could suck the moisture out of a desert.
And don't forget those personal diaries. Some of them, well, let's just say they make All Quiet on the Western Front look like a Disney movie.
Our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to dig into those sources, unearth the blunders, the forgotten stories, the moments that turn 1915 into a turning point in this whole bloody affair.
Oh, and trust me, it's going to get messy. We're not just talking about the Western Front trenches here, we're going global.
The Eastern Front's chaotic mess, the colonial struggles in Africa, and oh yes, let's not forget the grand spectacle of incompetence that was Gallipoli.
The whole year is basically a giant how not to wage war exhibit.
Well said. So let's set the stage, shall we?
The stage is January 1915. Europe is busy turning itself into one giant mud pit full of corpses. And over in Asia, Japan's like, hey, party's over here.
Right, we've got Japan, technically allied with Britain, but they're also eyeing this whole European brawl as a chance to, expand their portfolio a bit.
Portfolio of what? Misery?
Empire, my friend. They slapped China with the 21 demands, basically trying to turn them into a puppet state.
Bold move. But did it work? Was China just like, sure, Japan, whatever you say?
Oh, China was far from thrilled. They managed to push back against some of the more outlandish demands, proving that even in the middle of a world war, regional power plays are still very much a thing.
Sounds like everyone's got their own side hustle going on, even while the main gig is falling apart.
Precisely. And this whole incident really foreshadows Japan's growing appetite for, shall we say, regional influence. An appetite that will definitely have consequences down the line.
Right, because ambition and war, they go together like gasoline and a match.
A recipe for disaster, to be sure. But for now, let's head back to that European meat grinder, shall we? Lead the way.
So January also sees the Battle of Hartmannswillerkopf kicking off in the Vosges Mountains. Not exactly prime real estate, strategically speaking.
A tiny speck on the map. But it became the symbol of how utterly pointless and brutal the fighting had become.
Pointless in what way?
Both sides were pouring men and resources into this fight for a mountain peak that had zero strategic value.
Like a really bloody game of King of the Hill.
Exactly. Thousands of men died for a piece of rock.
Talk about a Pyrrhic victory.
A perfect illustration of how this war had shifted from maneuver and strategy to pure attrition, just grinding each other down until one side collapses from exhaustion. Okay, but January wasn't all trench warfare.
We also had the Battle of Doggerbank, a naval skirmish between the Brits and the Germans in the North Sea. Small scale, sure, but it hints at the growing importance of naval power in this whole conundrum.
You see, the Battle of Doggerbank, it was a wake-up call. Both sides realized they were willing to risk their big, expensive battleships to control the seas.
Why was that so important, aside from, not wanting your ship sunk?
Because controlling the seas meant controlling the flow of supplies, food, and men. And that had huge strategic implications.
Right, because you can't fight a war if you're starving and out of ammunition.
Exactly. You see, even though it was a relatively small engagement, it foreshadowed the crucial role naval warfare would play as the war dragged on.
Okay, so we've got empires crumbling, but now we've got unrest brewing within the empires themselves. The Chilembwe uprising in Nyasaland, which is modern-day Malawi, really highlights this.
This Baptist preacher, John Chilembwe, he leads this revolt against British rule.
What? So this war is so chaotic, it's inspiring uprisings, even in the colonies.
The war acted like a pressure cooker. It exposed the weaknesses of the colonial system, and people like Gallipoli saw an opportunity to strike.
It's like the war was this giant earthquake, and the aftershocks were felt across the entire world.
A very apt analogy.
Speaking of shaking things up, in late January, the Ottomans decided to have a go at the Suez Canal.
The First Suez Offensive. They called it their grand plan. Snatch the canal from the British.
Why? Did they need a shortcut to get somewhere?
The Suez Canal was, and still is, a vital strategic asset controlling the flow of trade between Europe and Asia.
Asia! So they wanted to play a little game of who controls the spice trade.
You could say that the problem was the Ottoman attack was, to put it politely, a complete disaster. Poor planning, poor execution. It was a humiliating defeat.
So not only did they not get the canal, they basically handed the British a reason to double down their defenses.
Exactly. It also underscored the challenges the Central Powers were facing. Fighting on multiple fronts, resources stretched thin, constantly playing catch-up with the Allies.
It's tough to win when you're fighting a war on, like, 5 credit cards.
And speaking of questionable decisions, let's talk about what the Germans cooked up on the Eastern Front.
Oh boy, what did they do now?
January 31st, 1915. The Battle of Bulomov. Germany, in a stroke of genius, decides to deploy tear gas against the Russians.
Tear gas? That's it? I mean, compared to what we know they'll do later, that seems pretty tame.
Oh, it was a big deal at the time. It was the first use of chemical weapons in the war.
I guess you have to start somewhere, right?
And start they did. It may not have been as immediately lethal as, say, chlorine gas, which they'll use later, but it was a clear violation of the Hague Conventions and opened the door to a whole new level of horror in warfare.
Yeah, once you cross that line, there's no going back. It's like opening Pandora's box of nasty surprises.
And just to make sure February started off with a bang, Germany declares unrestricted submarine warfare on February 4th. Essentially, they're saying any ship in the water is fair game no matter who they are or what they're carrying.
So much for those international laws of war, huh?
A bold, some might say reckless, gamble. They were trying to strangle Britain's supply lines, but they massively misjudged the diplomatic fallout, especially with the Americans.
Yeah, sinking a few of their ships tends to do that.
Oh, they'll learn that lesson the hard way. It was a major strategic blunder, highlighting just how desperate Germany was becoming. And while all this is happening, the Russians are having their own fun on the Eastern Front. The Second Battle of the Masurian Lakes, another crushing defeat for the Tsar's forces.
The Russian army in 1915. Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Understatement of the century. They were poorly equipped, poorly led, and their morale was evaporating faster than a puddle in the Sahara Desert.
You can practically hear the revolution brewing in the distance, can't you?
Oh, it's definitely rumbling. And to add insult to injury, February also saw the Singapore Mutiny.
Wait, hold on. A mutiny? As in British troops turning on their own?
Yep. Indian troops stationed in Singapore decided they'd had enough. They mutinied, and it took the British days to put it down.
Wow. So it's not just empires crumbling, it's the internal structure of those empires starting to crack as well.
The pressure cooker of war, my friend. It exposes the weak points in every system.
Okay. And as if all that wasn't enough to keep everyone busy, February also marks the start of the infamous Gallipoli campaign.
Ah, yes, Gallipoli, Churchill's brainchild. The plan was to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war by seizing control of the Dardanelles Straits.
Sounds simple enough, right? What could possibly go wrong?
On paper, maybe. In reality, it was a disaster waiting to happen. The Allies massively underestimated the Ottoman defenses, and the terrain was a nightmare.
Yeah, we've already seen how well those big, bold defenses worked out in the first few weeks of 1915. Spoiler alert, not well at all.
Gallipoli was a textbook case of overconfidence and underestimation. A theme that will unfortunately become very familiar as we delve deeper into 1915.
And on that cheery note, the fun's just getting started.
It's going to be a wild ride. So, as we stumble into March 1915, I think it's safe to say, well, this whole quick victory thing, yeah, that ship has sailed.
Sailed straight into a hurricane by the looks of it.
More like a typhoon, the grand illusion of a glorious, swift end to all this. Gone, poof, vanished.
Replaced with the lovely reality of mud, blood, and a whole lot of dying for, well, what exactly?
Excellent question. And March just decides to pour gasoline on the dumpster fire that is 1915.
Gas on the fire? That's an understatement. We're talking political maneuvering that would make a used car salesman blush. Battles that achieve absolutely nothing except a higher body count.
And a general sense that no one has a clue what they're doing. Case in point, the Entente powers, in their infinite wisdom, decide to promise Constantinople to Russia.
Wait, what? They're just casually handing out cities that don't even belong to them?
Oh, just a little incentive to keep Russia in the game because, throwing millions of their own men into the meat grinder wasn't enough.
It's like they're playing Monopoly with real countries.
And using real lives as currency. This move, its so discord among the Allies, created a diplomatic mess that would haunt them for decades.
Diplomatic mess is putting it mildly. I think someone spilled the entire game board and decided to make up the rules as they went along.
And while the politicians are busy playing Risk with real countries, the poor sods on the ground are still stuck in this bloody stalemate. The Battle of Neuve-Chapelle kicks off in March. Another one of those brilliant British offensives on the Western Front.
Oh, you mean the one that was supposed to be a game changer and ended up being a muddy, bloody mess?
You've got it. Initial gains quickly bogged down, heavy losses, minimal strategic impact.
At least they didn't resort to poison gas this time.
Yeah.
Small victories, right?
Give them time. March wasn't all doom and gloom, though. Remember that pesky German East Asia squadron? The one causing trouble in the Pacific?
Oh yeah, those guys. They were like the rebellious teenagers of the German Navy, off joyriding halfway across the world.
Well, their joyride came to an end in the Battle of Mazza Sakura off the coast of Chile. The British finally caught up with them and sent them to the bottom of the ocean.
Ah, so justice was served, or at least some rusty underwater version of it.
You could say that. It was a reminder that this war really was global, with tentacles reaching the most unexpected corners of the world.
Yeah, trying to wage war on multiple continents when you don't even have airplanes yet. Talk about a logistical nightmare.
Speaking of nightmares, let's check back in on Gallipoli, shall we?
Oh no, please don't tell me they didn't actually go through with that whole naval attack on the Dardanelles, did they?
What can I say? They were committed to this whole attacking heavily fortified positions head-on strategy.
And how did that work out for them?
You're going to love this. They lost 3 battleships to mines and Ottoman artillery fire. It was a complete and utter debacle.
I'm shocked, I tell you.
I'm sure you are. It was a colossal failure, highlighting once again the Allied tendency to underestimate their opponents.
At least they learned their lesson, right?
Oh, you're going to love what they do next. This little naval fiasco set the stage for the even more disastrous land invasion at Gallipoli. Just a few weeks later,
they decided to double down on a losing hand.
You've got it. But hey, it wasn't all bad news. In March, the Russians, after months of trying, finally managed to capture the fortress of Przemysl.
A victory! Huzzah! Did they throw a parade? Break out the vodka?
More like a sigh of relief. It was a tactical victory, sure, but it did little to address the fundamental problems plaguing the Russian army. Their supply lines were a mess, their leadership was incompetent, and the whole country was on the verge of imploding.
One measly fortress wasn't going to fix that, was it?
Not a chance. So, as March 1915 comes to a close, the war is basically a global dumpster fire.
And someone just threw a grenade into the dumpster.
A very apt analogy. Battle lines are hardening, the casualties are mounting, and the few glimmers of hope are quickly extinguished by the relentless reality of war.
So, what fresh hell awaits us in April? Don't hold back. I can take.
Oh, April doesn't disappoint. It delivers a whole new level of horror. We're talking about the start of the Armenian genocide.
Okay? Yeah, that's not good. Not good at all. We're talking about the systematic deportation and murder of over 1 million Armenians by the Ottoman government.
It's a chilling reminder of how quickly things can spiral out of control when fear, paranoia, and nationalism take hold.
So, basically, the Ottomans decided that the best way to deal with internal dissent was to eliminate an entire ethnic group.
In a nutshell, yes. It's a stain on humanity and a stark warning about the dangers of unchecked power.
But wait, there's more. April also brings us the Second Battle of Ypres. And guess what the Germans decided to bring to the party?
Oh, just a little something they'd been working on. Chlorine gas.
Chlorine gas, as in the stuff they use to clean swimming pools?
The very same. They released this greenish-yellow cloud that drifted across the Allied trenches, causing agonizing deaths and widespread panic.
Okay, even for 1915, that's pretty messed up. I mean, how do you even justify using a weapon like that? It's indiscriminate. It kills everyone in its path.
It was a desperate and morally reprehensible attempt to break the stalemate. And it worked to a degree, but it also opened a door that could never be closed. The use of chemical weapons became a horrifying reality of modern warfare.
Yeah, once you cross that line, there's no going back. It's like giving a toddler a loaded gun.
And speaking of bad decisions, let's not forget about those Allied landings at Gallipoli.
Oh, right, the Gallipoli landings. Another brilliant plan hatched in the war rooms of, well, somewhere far, far away from the actual fighting.
April 25, the Allies land at Cape Helles and Anzac Cove, facing immediate and fierce resistance from the Ottomans.
Can you imagine being one of those soldiers landing on a narrow beach under heavy fire with no idea what's waiting for you?
It must have been absolute chaos. And the terrain? Let's just say it wasn't exactly designed for a leisurely stroll.
More like a death trap by the sounds of it.
The Allies were walking straight into a meat grinder, and they barely even knew it.
So while all this is happening, Italy decides to switch sides. They signed the Treaty of London with the Entente powers, betraying their alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary.
Ah, the fickle finger of fate. Or should we say the lure of territorial gains? Italy, always the opportunist, decided to jump on the Allied bandwagon.
Because adding another front to this already chaotic war was exactly what everyone needed.
But hold on to your hats, because the real game changer, the event that sends shockwaves across the globe, is just around the corner. May 7th, 1915. The day a German U-boat sinks the Lusitania.
Ah yes, the Lusitania, a British passenger liner sunk off the coast of Ireland, over 1,200 people dead, including 128 Americans.
It was a horrific tragedy that outraged the world and pushed the United States closer to war.
The Germans claimed the Lusitania was carrying munitions, but sinking a passenger ship with civilians on board. Talk about a PR nightmare.
A massive blunder, strategically and diplomatically. And while this international incident is unfolding, things are heating up on the Eastern Front. The Germans launched the Gorlast-Hanau offensive, and it's not pretty.
This is the one that basically sends the Russians running for the hills, right?
More like a full-blown retreat. The Russian lines crumbled and they were forced to abandon Poland and Galicia. Millions of men lost, the morale shattered, and the Tsar's grip on power weakening by the day.
It's like watching a slow-motion train wreck, and you know it's going to be bad, but you just can't look away.
And just to add fuel to the fire, Italy officially declares war on Austria-Hungary on May 23rd. So now we've got a new front in the Alps. The Russians are in full retreat and the Americans are getting increasingly restless.
1915 is turning out to be a real banner year for all the wrong reasons.
And we're only halfway through.
Oh boy, I can't wait to see what other delightful surprises await us in the second half of this year. The thrilling conclusion to our 1915 world tour of misery and mayhem.
Where the hits just keep on coming. And by hits, we mean catastrophic military blunders and a steadily rising body count.
Yeah, we've seen empires crumble, alliances shift like the desert sands, and enough strategic incompetence to make a military historian weep.
But hold on tight, because the second half of 1915, well, it decides to crank things up to 11.
11? That's putting it mildly. We've got the Russian army doing its best impression of a lemming migration heading straight off a cliff. Gallipoli is turning into a monument to military ineptitude, and the Italian front, well, let's just say it's not exactly a gondola ride through Venice.
Venice? More like a gondola ride through hell with Dante as your tour guide.
So where do we even begin to unpack this suitcase of sorrow?
Let's start with the Eastern Front, shall we? Remember that little thing called the Gorlast-Hanau offensive? The one where the Central Powers basically decided to play bowling with the Russian army, and the Russian army were the pins.
Ah yes, that was a real confidence booster for the Tsar's regime.
Confidence booster? More like a confidence annihilator. That offensive kicked off what became known as the Great Retreat, which is a nice way of saying the Russians were running away faster than a politician from a scandal.
They were abandoning territory like it was going out of style.
Right.
Millions of men lost morale, plummeting faster than a meteor. And the Tsar, well, let's just say he was starting to look a little less Tsar-like and a lot more like a guy who lost his car keys and his winning lottery ticket on the same day.
A very vivid image, but apt nonetheless. The Great Retreat exposed all the cracks in the Russian military machine. Cracks that had been there for decades, but were now impossible to ignore.
So basically, the Russian army was the Titanic and 1915 was the iceberg.
A very fitting analogy. The ship was sinking and everyone knew it. But hey, at least the band was still playing.
Speaking of sinking ships, remember Italy's grand entrance into the war on the side of the Allies?
Ah yes, Italy. Land of pizza, pasta, and a long history of, well, let's call it strategic flexibility. They decided to open up a new front in the Alps because, why not?
Because nothing says welcome to the war like a nice mountain climb with machine guns and artillery fire.
The First Battle of the Isonzo, which kicked off in June, basically set the tone for the entire Italian front. Brutal fighting, minimal gains, and a whole lot of scenic vistas to die for.
So basically like the Western Front, but with better views.
Exactly, and just as scenic and pointless. And while all this is happening, there's actually a small glimmer of good news for the Allies.
Wait, hold on, you're telling me something good happened in 1915? I need to sit down for this.
Down in German Southwest Africa, modern-day Namibia. The South African forces had been slugging it out with the German colonial troops. And in July, after months of fighting, the Germans surrendered.
A victory! Someone actually won something? Did they at least get a participation trophy?
More like a consolation prize. It wasn't exactly a game changer in the grand scheme of things, but it did highlight the global nature of the conflict and the fact that colonial troops were being drawn into this mess, often with tragic results.
Yeah, the glories of empire, eh? Speaking of glorious, July also brought a technological advancement that would change the face of warfare forever.
Oh, did someone finally invent the tank? Because that would at least make things a little more interesting.
Not quite, but they did achieve the first aerial victory using a synchronized gun-armed fighter aircraft.
So they figured out how to shoot through the propeller blades without turning their own plane into a giant spinning cheese grater.
That's pretty impressive, actually. But also kind of terrifying because it opened up a whole new dimension of warfare.
Warfare just got a serious upgrade and not necessarily for the better.
Great, just what we needed. More efficient ways to kill each other. But hey, at least it's progress, right?
If you can call it that. Now let's fast forward to August, shall we?
August? Yes, where the Russian retreat is still in full swing, the Italians are stuck in the mountains, and oh yeah, Gallipoli. How's that little adventure going? I'm sure it's all going according to plan.
Oh, you're going to love this. On August 6th, the Allies, in their infinite wisdom, launch a massive offensive at Gallipoli. Their goal to break the stalemate and salvage some kind of victory from this disaster.
Spoiler alert, it didn't go well.
What gave it away? The August offensive was a series of poorly coordinated attacks that achieved nothing but massive casualties. The fighting at Chinook Bear, Sari Bear Range, Hill 60, the Neck. It was brutal and ultimately pointless.
It's like they were trying to put out a fire with gasoline.
A fitting analogy. For much of 1915, the Gallipoli campaign was a tragic testament to the dangers of overconfidence, poor planning, and a stubborn refusal to admit defeat.
Yeah, someone should have told Churchill that sometimes retreat is the better part of valor.
Hindsight is always 20/20. Meanwhile, back on the Eastern Front, September brings more bad news for the Russians. The Germans capture the city of Vilnius, effectively ending the Gorlice-Tarnow offensive.
Another crushing defeat for the Tsar's forces. They were losing territory, men, and morale at an alarming rate.
The writing was on the wall for the Tsarist regime, but they seemed determined to ignore it.
And speaking of ignoring things, after months of international pressure, Germany finally decides to suspend its unrestricted submarine warfare campaign.
A temporary reprieve, but the problem remained. Germany needed to break the British blockade, but they couldn't risk alienating the US completely. It was a delicate balancing act, and one that would ultimately prove impossible to maintain.
Unrestricted submarine warfare. It's like a bad habit. You should quit, but you just can't seem to help yourself.
And just when you thought things couldn't get any worse, the British decide to launch their own ill-fated offensive on the Western Front. The Battle of Loos.
Let me guess. Heavy casualties, minimal gains, and a whole lot of mud.
You're getting the hang of this Western Front thing. And as if all that wasn't enough, October brings us a new theater of operations. The Balkans. The Allies, in a desperate attempt to help their Serbian allies, land troops at Salonika in Greece.
Yes, the Salonika campaign. A classic example of too little, too late. They were too late to save Serbia. And the new Balkan front quickly devolved into yet another bloody stalemate. So basically, they achieved nothing except tying up more troops and resources in a war that was already consuming everything in its path.
You do have a knack for summarizing things succinctly.
It's a gift. But wait, there's more. October also sees the execution of Edith Cavell, a British nurse who'd been helping Allied soldiers escape from occupied Belgium.
A tragic event that was quickly exploited by Allied propaganda. Her death became a symbol of German barbarity, further demonizing the enemy and fueling public support for the war.
It's a reminder that even in the midst of this unimaginable horror, there's still room for individual acts of courage and compassion. and also a reminder that propaganda can be a powerful weapon capable of twisting even the most tragic events to serve a particular narrative.
Indeed. And speaking of narratives, November brings us a new player to the game. Bulgaria, lured by the promise of territorial gains, throws in its lot with the Central Powers.
Because everyone loves a good land grab, right? Even if it means joining a war that's already spiraling out of control.
Bulgaria's entry into the war was a strategic victory for Germany. It consolidated their position in the Balkans, secured their supply lines to the Ottoman Empire, and further isolated Russia.
So basically, the dominoes are starting to fall, and not in a good way.
As 1915 draws to a close, it's becoming increasingly clear that this war is far from over. It has spread across the globe. The death toll is mounting, and the initial optimism has been replaced by a grim sense of resignation.
This isn't a sprint, it's a marathon. A marathon of attrition, where the finish line seems to move further away with every passing day.
1915 was a year of shattered illusions, broken promises, and a descent into a level of barbarity that few could have imagined. It was a year that changed the world forever. A year that marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new and uncertain future.
Well, folks, that concludes our deep dive into 1915. We've waded through the mud of the trenches, witnessed the horrors of poison gas and genocide, and marveled at the sheer incompetence of military leadership on all sides.
It's been an experience, hasn't it? One that I wouldn't necessarily recommend repeating.
But hopefully we've learned something along the way. Yeah, perhaps a reminder that war, no matter how justified or glorious it might seem, is ultimately a failure of diplomacy, a descent into barbarity, and a tragedy for all involved.
Indeed. And with that cheery thought, thanks for joining us for Battlefield Ledger's Chronicles of the Great War, year by year, 1915. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss the next episode.